The pier house, once alive with Darius's laughter, now pulsed with a different energy, a swarm of boots and barking voices turning it into a crime scene. Marcus Kane knelt on the weathered planks, his son's blood soaking into his jeans, warm and sticky against his palms. Darius's body lay still, the football rolling lazily toward the edge, a mocking echo of the life snuffed out moments ago. His cousins had scattered, their screams fading into the salty breeze, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of his boy's cooling form. Officers Trent Baxter and Kyle Voss loomed nearby, their silhouettes sharp against the flashing lights of squad cars lining the gravel drive. Baxter, stocky with a buzz cut that gleamed under the floodlights, holstered his pistol with a casual flick, his lips curling into something smug. Voss, leaner and twitchy, kept his gun low but ready, his pale eyes darting between Marcus and the growing crowd beyond the pier's railing. Marcus's hands trembled, not from fear, but from a fury coiling deep in his gut, a beast he'd caged since leaving the battlefields of Fallujah. He pressed his fingers harder against Darius's chest, as if he could force life back into the bullet-riddled flesh, but the holes stared back, dark and final. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low, steady, cutting through, the chaos like a blade. Baxter snorted, stepping closer, his boots thudding against the wood. "Kid, reach for something, old man. We don't take chances with thieves." Marcus's eyes flicked to the football, now resting against a piling, its leather scuffed from Darius's last throw. "That's what you saw?" he asked, his tone flat, but laced with venom. Voss chuckled, a high-pitched sound that grated against the night. "Doesn't matter what we saw, matters what we say we saw." The air thickened as more cops arrived, their radios crackling with static and commands. Marcus stayed rooted, his knees aching against the splintered boards, his mind racing through decades of training, every instinct screaming to snap their necks where they stood. But he held still, knowing the game had shifted the second those bullets flew. A woman's voice cut through the murmur, sharp and shaky, from the crowd pressed against the police tape. "I got it all on my phone. They shot him for nothing." Marcus's head tilted slightly, catching the glint of a screen held high, the neighbor's footage already lighting up the darkness with its grainy truth. Baxter's smirk faltered, just for a split second, before he barked at a rookie cop to confiscate the device. Too late. The video was out, uploaded, racing across the internet like wildfire through dry grass. Marcus rose slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding with a predator's grace, blood dripping from his hands onto the pier. The cops tensed, Voss's grip tightening on his weapon, but Marcus kept his palms open, visible, a calculated move to keep them guessing. "You're making a mistake," he said, locking eyes with Baxter, whose smugness had hardened into something colder. "Step back, hands up," Baxter snapped, his voice losing its edge as Marcus's stare bore into him. "Now." Marcus complied, but not before memorizing every line of their faces, every twitch of their fingers, storing it for the war he knew was coming. Voss shoved him toward a squad car, slamming cuffs around his wrists with more force than necessary, the metal biting into his skin. "Resisting arrest," Voss muttered, loud enough for the other officers to hear, a lie they'd all back without. "Question." Inside the car, the stench of sweat and stale coffee clogged Marcus's nose as they drove him to the station, the pier house shrinking in the rearview mirror. Baxter rode shotgun, twisting to grin at him through the partition. "Should have taught your boy to listen, soldier. Might still be breathing." Marcus's jaw clenched, his pulse hammering, but he said nothing, letting the taunt sink into the silence. He knew they'd checked his ID by now, seen the retired military status, but they didn't know the half of it. Delta Force wasn't just a job, it was a forge, and Marcus had been hammered into something unbreakable. They thought they'd won, thought this was just another black man they could bury under their boots. They were wrong. The station was a squat brick building, its fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped flies. They dragged Marcus through the back entrance, past rows of desks where officers glanced up, some with curiosity, others with disdain. Voss shoved him into a holding room, a concrete box with a single chair bolted to the floor. "Sit tight," he said, slamming the door. Marcus stood instead, pacing the small space, his mind already mapping the layout, the exits, the weak points. He'd been in worse spots, caves in Afghanistan with RPGs raining down, but this was different. This was personal. The blood on his hands had dried, flaking off in dark specks, a constant reminder of why he couldn't stop. Hours crawled by, the silence broken only by the occasional clang of metal doors down the hall. Then the shouting started, muffled at first, filtering through the walls. Marcus pressed his ear to the cold concrete, catching fragments. Videos everywhere, chiefs pissed, protesters outside. His lips twitched, the faintest hint of a grim smile. That neighbor's footage was doing its work, spreading faster than the cops could contain it. The door swung open, and Baxter stormed in, his face flushed red, sweat beading on his forehead. "You think you're some kind of hero now?" he spat, grabbing Marcus by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes locked on Baxter's, calm and unyielding. "Your kid's dead, that's the end of it." Voss followed, smirking as he leaned against the doorframe. "Internet's full of bleeding hearts, but it won't change shit. Chief's already on it." Marcus tilted his head, his voice a low rumble. "What's he saying?" Baxter's grip tightened, but Voss answered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Unverified footage, technical glitch, nothing admissible." Marcus nodded slowly, filing it away. The system was circling its wagons, shielding its own, just like always. But he'd seen systems break before, cracked them open with his own hands. This wouldn't be different. They uncuffed him long enough to process the charges. A sham list scribbled on a clipboard. Resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, assault on an officer. Lies stacked on lies, each one a brick in the wall they thought would hold him. The desk sergeant, a wiry man with a grey mustache, barely looked up as he stamped the papers, muttering about troublemakers. Marcus signed where they told him, his handwriting steady, deliberate, a silent promise that this paperwork wouldn't be the end. They shoved him into a cell, a 6x8 cage with a stained mattress and a flickering bulb, the door clanging. Shut with a finality they thought meant victory. Alone, Marcus sat on the edge of the bunk, elbows on his knees, staring at the blood still caked under his nails. The protests outside grew louder, a distant roar seeping through the high, barred window. He could picture it. People spilling into the streets, signs scrawled with Darius's name, fists raised against the night sky. That video had lit the match and the town was catching fire, but he knew the cops wouldn't let it burn unchecked. Baxter and Voss had underestimated him, sure, but the real threat was higher up. Someone with enough pull to smother the truth before it spread too far. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and purposeful. A new figure appeared, a broad-shouldered man in a sheriff's uniform, his badge glinting under the harsh light. Dan Hargrove, the name stitched above his chest, his face weathered and hard, eyes like steel traps. He didn't open the cell, just stood there, arms crossed, studying Marcus like a hunter sizing up prey. "You're a problem, Kane," he said, his voice deep, gravelly, carrying the weight of command. "But I've dealt with problems before." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching, recognizing the type. Ex-military, probably saw action, thought, he owned this town. "You killed my son," Marcus said, not a question, just a fact. Hargrove's lip twitched, almost a smile. "My boys did their job. You'll see how this ends." Hargrove turned to leave, but Marcus called after him, his voice cutting through the air. "You don't know who I am." The sheriff paused, glancing back, a flicker of curiosity in his cold stare. "Retired soldier, big deal. Doesn't mean squat here?" Marcus stood, stepping to the bars, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Keep thinking that." Hargrove walked away, his boots fading into the hum of the station, but the threat lingered, thick and unspoken. Marcus sank back onto the bunk, his mind racing. The video was out there, the protests were growing, but Hargrove was the real enemy, the puppet master pulling strings to bury this. And Marcus? He was just getting started. The cell walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and despair. But Marcus's focus sharpened. He'd lost Darius, the one piece of his life that mattered more than any medal or mission, and these bastards thought they could laugh it off. They didn't know the hell he'd brought home from the wars, the skills he'd honed in shadows they'd never understand. The cuffs, the charges, the lies, They were nothing compared to what he'd endured, what he'd do next. Outside, the world was waking up to the truth, but inside Marcus was forging a plan, one that would make them pay, one that would turn their victory into ash. The night stretched on, and with every passing minute, the beast in his chest growled louder, ready to break free. The county jail was a concrete tomb, its air thick with the sour tang of sweat and rust, the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead buzzing like a dying insect. Marcus Kane sat on the edge of the bunk, his broad shoulders hunched, blood still crusted, under his nails from cradling Darius's lifeless body. His cell was a tight squeeze, 6 feet by 8, walls scarred with graffiti from men who'd long since lost their fight. But Marcus wasn't them. His mind churned, replaying the pier house slaughter, the smug grins of Baxter and Voss, the sheriff's cold promise. He'd been in worse traps, jungles where the enemy didn't wear badges, but this was a different war, one where the rules were stacked against him before the first shot. Voices drifted through the bars, low and conspiratorial, pulling him from his thoughts. He pressed his ear to the wall, the concrete cool against his skin, catching fragments of Baxter and Voss's plot. "Frame him good," Baxter growled, his voice muffled but sharp. "Assault, maybe battery. Say he swung first." Voss's laugh was a jagged edge. "Old man's military, right? We'll call it PTSD, make him a nutcase." Marcus's fists clenched, knuckles whitening. They weren't just burying Darius. They were building a cage around him, one lie at a time. Did they think he'd sit quiet while they smeared his name, his son's memory? He'd spent 20 years dismantling traps deadlier than this. They had no idea what they'd stirred. The guard shift came at midnight. A lanky kid with acne scars and a nervous tic, his keys jangling like a warning bell. Marcus watched him through slitted eyes, timing his steps, noting the pen tucked in his shirt pocket, its cheap plastic glinting under the light. Opportunity. When the kid slid a tray of grey slop through the slot, Marcus moved, smooth and silent, a shadow honed by decades of stealth. "Water," he rasped, voice rough but deliberate, drawing the guard closer. The kid hesitated, then stepped in, fumbling with a plastic bottle. Marcus struck, snatching the pen and jamming it into the guard's wrist, twisting until the keys dropped with a clatter. The kid yelped, clutching his arm, but Marcus was already on him, a knee to the gut folding him in half, then a chokehold dropping him limp to the floor. He scooped up the keys, heart steady, breath controlled, every move, a calculated echo of missions long past. The lock clicked open, and he slipped into the corridor, a ghost in the dimness, avoiding the camera's lazy arcs. Could he outrun the system that had already judged him? The jail was a maze, but he'd memorized the layout from the ride in. Left past the drunk tank, right at the flickering exit sign, straight to the parking lot. He pried open a fire door, the night air hitting him like a slap, cool and briny off the coast. Freedom beckoned, a sliver of hope in the chaos, but he knew it wouldn't last. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the lot in blinding white, and a SWAT team materialized, black armor gleaming, rifles trained. "On the ground, Kane," a voice boomed, amplified through a bullhorn. Marcus froze, hands half raised, scanning the line. 6 men, 2 with shotguns, 1 with a sniper scope glinting from a rooftop. He'd faced worse odds, but not with Darius's blood still staining his soul. "I'm not armed," he called, voice cutting through the tension, buying seconds to think. They didn't care. A baton cracked against his skull, stars exploding in his vision, and he stumbled, asphalt biting his knees. Boots swarmed, fists and steel raining down, splitting his lip, bruising his ribs, turning his escape into a slaughter. They didn't stop. A knee drove into his spine, pinning him as cuffs snapped back on, tighter this time, cutting into his wrists until blood trickled warm down his fingers. "Dangerous fugitive," one grunted, a faceless shadow in the chaos, justifying the brutality. With a lie. Marcus's head swam, pain pulsing, but his eyes stayed open, locked on the lead officer's boots, memorizing the tread pattern. They dragged him back inside, tossing him into a new cell, this one deeper in the jail, steel walls cold and unyielding. His body ached, blood pooling under his torn shirt, but his mind burned clearer than ever. Had they beaten the fight out? Of him, or just stoked the fire. The door slammed shut, the clang echoing like a gunshot, and Marcus slumped against the wall, breath ragged but steady. He'd slipped their grasp, if only for minutes, proved he wasn't their pawn. But the cost was steep. Footsteps approached again, slower this time, deliberate. Sheriff Dan Hargrove loomed outside the bars, his broad frame filling the doorway, a smirk tugging at his weathered face. "Thought you'd run, huh?" he said, voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing special, Kane. Just another thug who doesn't know his place." Marcus spat blood onto the floor, meeting Hargrove's gaze with steel. "You're scared," he said, low and sure. "That's why you're here." Hargrove's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something darker. "You're done," he snapped, turning away, but not before Marcus caught the unease in his stride. The sheriff knew the video was out there, knew the protests were swelling, but he thought he could still crush this. Marcus slid down the wall, resting his head against the cold steel, replaying the beating. They'd called him a fugitive, a threat, words dripping with the same poison that had killed Darius. Racism wasn't just in the trigger pull, it was in every fist, every lie, every badge that shielded them. Could a system this rotten ever bend, or would it have to break? Hours later, a new sound pierced the jail's hum, a news chopper's blades, slicing the air outside, faint but growing. Marcus tilted his head toward the high window, too small to see through, but the noise told him enough. The beating hadn't gone quiet. Someone had caught it, aired it live, a second crack in the cop's armor. He pictured the footage, his body crumpling under boots, blood streaking the asphalt. The SWAT team's overkill laid bare for the world. The station buzzed with panic now, radios crackling, voices rising. "Channel 5's got it. Mayor's on the line." Marcus's lips twitched, a grim satisfaction settling in. The truth was clawing its way out despite their fists, but the system didn't sleep. A TV blared down the hall, the mayor's voice smooth and practiced, oozing through the walls. "We stand by our officers. This was a necessary response to a violent escape attempt. Public safety comes first." Marcus's stomach twisted, not from the pain, but from the gall of it. Necessary? Violent? They'd beaten a handcuffed man, a grieving father, and called it duty. The news anchor chimed in, hesitant but clear. "Eyewitnesses dispute the official account, citing excessive force." The words faded as boots stomped closer, guards muttering about locking it down. They knew the tide was shifting, but they'd double down before they drowned. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the ache in his bones fuel his resolve. He'd escaped, shown them he could slip their grip, and they'd answered with brutality, proving every fear Darius had ever whispered about this town. The video, the beating, the protests, they were sparks, but Hargrove was the storm waiting to smother them. Marcus's military past, his Delta Force edge, they'd dismissed it as nothing, a footnote to mock. Did they really think a soldier like him would fold under their clubs? He'd taken down warlords with less swagger than these small-town tyrants. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. So what do you think? Should Marcus have let them cuff him without a fight, or was breaking free worth the cost? Comment 1 if you think he should have stayed calm. 2 if you back his escape, and smash that like button if you're raging at these cops' lies. Subscribe now, because the next chapter is about to blow this town apart. Will the protests save Marcus, or will Hargrove's next move bury him deeper? How far would you go if the system turned on you like this? The high-security cell was a steel coffin, colder and tighter than the last, its walls slick with condensation that dripped onto the concrete floor. Marcus Kane sat on the bare slab that passed for a bunk, his bruised ribs screaming with every breath, blood crusting over the gash on his temple from the SWAT team's batons. The flickering bulb above had burned out, leaving him in a dim haze pierced only by the faint glow of a guard stationed down the hall. His escape had rattled them. This cell, buried deep in the jail's bowels, was their answer, a cage meant to break him. But Marcus's mind didn't rest. He traced the cracks in the wall with his eyes, mapping angles, listening to the hum of the building, waiting for the next move in a game he'd already begun to turn. Outside, the world was erupting. A smuggled radio, slipped to him by a janitor, with shaky hands and a whispered, "They're lying about you," crackled to life in the early hours. Marcus pressed it to his ear, the static giving way to a news report that sent a jolt through his battered frame. Protests swelled overnight in downtown South Carolina after footage of Marcus Kane's brutal recapture aired live. Crowds clashed, with riot police demanding justice for his son Darius, gunned down on a pier 2 nights ago. The anchor's voice trembled slightly, as if she felt the weight of the story. Witnesses claim the police fired first, unprovoked, and now this. Beating has sparked outrage across the state. Marcus's jaw tightened, a flicker of grim pride cutting through the pain. Darius's death wasn't fading into silence. The people were carrying it, amplifying it. The radio hissed as a protester's voice broke in, raw and furious. "They shot a kid for nothing, then beat his dad like an animal. We're not letting this go." Marcus's fingers curled around the device, the cheap plastic creaking under his grip. He pictured the streets, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, signs, scrawled with his son's name, tear gas clouds swirling under streetlights. It was chaos, but it was power, a force Hargrove couldn't ignore. The sheriff thought he'd locked this away, smothered it with cuffs and lies, but the truth was, clawing free, one scream at a time. Marcus needed to fan that flame, turn it. Into a blaze they couldn't stamp out. The janitor wasn't the only one slipping through cracks. A guard, a wiry man with a limp and a face etched with quiet guilt, paced the hall on the next shift. Marcus had clocked him earlier, the way his eyes darted away when they met, the slight tremble in his hands. A weak link. When the guard paused, near the cell, Marcus leaned forward, voice low and steady. "You know they're full of shit," he said, cutting through the silence. The guard flinched, glancing at the bars, then away. "I don't know nothing," he muttered, but his tone wavered. Marcus pressed harder. "You saw the video. My son's dead and they're framing me. I was Delta Force 20 years. Get my record out there. Let them see who they're burying." The guard shifted, sweat beading on his brow, but Marcus held, his gaze unblinking, the weight of his words sinking in. "You've got a kid, don't you?" he added, spotting the telltale photo peeking from the man's pocket. What if it was him? That hit home. The guard's shoulders slumped, and he nodded once, quick and sharp, before limping off. Marcus sat back, exhaling slowly. It was a gamble, but he'd played worse odds and won. If that record hit the airwaves, it'd shift the narrative. Paint him as the soldier he was, not the thug they wanted. Hours later, the radio crackled again, the anchor's voice sharper now. Breaking news. Military files confirm Marcus Kane served as a Delta Force commander, decorated for valor. Protesters are chanting his name, calling him a hero targeted by corruption. The cell seemed to hum with the echo of that broadcast, the sound filtering through the walls as if the building itself felt the shift. Marcus closed his eyes, picturing the crowd swelling, their voices rising in unison. Justice for Darius. Free Marcus. His chest tightened, not from the bruises but from the flicker of hope, fragile but real. He'd cracked their armor again, turned their lies into a spotlight on his truth. The guard had come through, and now the world knew. This wasn't just a grieving father. This was a warrior they'd underestimated. For a moment he let himself believe it might be enough, that the tide was turning, that justice might claw its way through the muck. But Hargrove didn't sleep on threats. The radio cut to a new report, the anchor's tone darkening. Sheriff Dan Hargrove has released a statement alleging Marcus Kane ran a drug operation from his military days. Evidence, including narcotics, was found in an old army locker linked to him. Marcus's eyes snapped open, fury boiling in his veins. Drugs. His locker. He'd left that life clean, every mission above board, every medal earned in blood. This was a plant, a desperate swing from a man who'd rather burn the town than lose his grip. The anchor continued. Hargrove vows to end this uprising, calling it a criminal conspiracy led by Kane and his supporters. The cell door rattled, and two new guards stormed in, their faces masks of cold efficiency. Up, one barked, yanking Marcus to his feet, his ribs screaming as they shoved him against the wall. They frisked him rougher than necessary, tearing the radio from his hands and smashing it under a boot. Sheriff's orders, The other grunted, cuffing him so tight the metal dug into his bones. They dragged him down the hall, past cells where inmates stared in silence, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. Marcus kept his head high, refusing to let the pain show, but inside the beast roared louder. Hargrove wasn't just fighting back. He was rewriting the story, turning Marcus into the villain to justify the blood already spilled. They threw him into an interrogation room, a stark box with a steel table and a one-way mirror, reflecting his battered face. Hargrove strode. In minutes later, his sheriff's star glinting like a taunt, his broad frame filling the space with menace. "You're a clever bastard," he said, voice low and gravelly, a predator sizing up prey. "That Delta stunt almost worked. Almost." He dropped a plastic bag on the table, white powder spilling from a slit, the evidence they'd planted. Marcus stared at it, then at Hargrove, his silence a weapon sharper than words. "You think I'd touch that shit?" he finally said, voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Hargrove leaned in, close enough for Marcus to smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Doesn't matter what you did. Matters what they believe." The sheriff straightened, pacing the room like a caged animal, his boots thudding against the tile. "Protests are loud, Kane, but they're nothing I can't handle. You're a dealer now, a thug who got his kid killed running a hustle. That's the story sticking." Marcus's hands flexed against the cuffs, the metal biting deeper, but he kept his gaze locked on Hargrove. "You're scared," he said. Again the same words he'd thrown in the cell, and this time they hit harder. Hargrove's lip twitched, his facade cracking for a split second before he slammed a fist on the table, the bag jumping. "I end things," he snarled. "You'll see." They hauled Marcus back to the cell, the guard's grips bruising his arms, but he didn't resist, not yet. His record was out, the protests were raging, and Hargrove's counter-strike was a desperate flail, a lie so bold it might just crumble under its own weight. The cell door clanged shut, and Marcus sank onto the slab, blood trickling from a reopened cut on his lip. He'd won a round, forced them to scramble, but the drugs, the smear, it was a gut punch he hadn't seen coming. Racism wasn't just in the bullets. It was in the ink rewriting his life, the system twisting his honor into a noose. The distant roar of the protests filtered through the walls, a lifeline in the dark. "Marcus! Marcus!" they chanted, their voices a drumbeat against Hargrove's. Lies. He'd given them a spark with that record, a glimpse of the man behind the cuffs, but the sheriff's move had doused it in filth. The radio was gone, but he didn't need it to know the streets were a battlefield now, riot shields clashing with raw fury. Hargrove thought he could drown this in noise, pin it on a black man's nature like they always did. Marcus's fingers traced the edge of the slab, his mind racing. He'd slipped their grasp once, he'd do it again. But next time it wouldn't be a sprint to the parking lot. It'd be a war they couldn't contain. The prison transfer van rattled down a potholed road, its engine growling under the strain. The dawn sky bleeding orange over South Carolina's coastal flats. Marcus Kane sat shackled in the back, wrists and ankles chained to a steel bench, the metal cold against his bruised skin. Two guards flanked him, their faces blank but their grips tight on batons, the air thick with the stench of diesel and fear. His ribs ached from the SWAT beating, his lips still split but his eyes burned sharp, scanning every jolt, every turn. Hargrove thought this move would bury him deeper, a high-security pen upstate where protests couldn't reach. Marcus had other plans. He'd survived ambushes in deserts hotter than this. A van wasn't his tomb. Outside, the world was a blur of scrub pines and salt marshes, but Marcus felt the shift coming before he saw it. A faint thud echoed, then smoke hissed, curling under the van's doors like a living thing. The driver cursed, swerving as tires screeched, and the guards tensed, barking into radios. "Ambush! Code red!" Marcus's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. His old Delta Force unit hadn't forgotten him. Shadows moved beyond the tinted windows, precise and lethal, and then the back doors blew open with a deafening bang, hinges twisting like paper. Smoke grenades rolled in, choking the air, and three figures in black tactical gear stormed the van. Their movements a dance Marcus knew by heart. The guards swung wildly, batons cutting through the haze, but they were outmatched. A silenced pistol, cracked twice, dropping them limp to the floor, blood pooling under their helmets. Marcus stayed still, chains rattling as a figure knelt before him, a familiar gravel voice cutting through the chaos. "Time to move, boss." It was Eli, his old second-in-command, eyes hard behind a balaclava, lockpicks flashing as he freed Marcus's wrists. The chains clattered free and Marcus flexed his hands, blood rushing back, the beast in his chest roaring awake. He grabbed a fallen baton, nodding once, and they bolted into the dawn, smoke swirling behind them like a shroud. They hit a rundown safe house on the town's outskirts by sunrise, a sagging shack nestled in a tangle of live oaks, moss dripping from the branches like tears. Marcus crouched inside, gulping water from a canteen, his team fanning out to secure the perimeter. Eli peeled off his mask, revealing a scarred face and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Protests got us the intel," he said, tossing Marcus a burner phone. "Whole country's watching now." Marcus nodded, the weight of Darius's death pressing harder, but freedom tasted sharp, a chance to strike back. He'd slipped Hargrove's net, turned the sheriff's smug transfer into a humiliation. For a moment, he let himself breathe, thinking he'd regained the upper hand, but Hargrove didn't flinch at setbacks. The safehouse radio crackled to life an hour later, a local station's voice trembling with urgency. "Breaking news. A fire has razed the Kane family home in South Carolina, leaving nothing but ash. Sheriff Dan Hargrove claims it's arson, linked to Marcus Kane's associates, calling it a desperate act by a fugitive." Marcus's stomach dropped, the canteen slipping from his grip, water splashing onto the warped floorboards. His sister Nia lived there, her kids too. He lunged for the phone, dialing her number, but it rang dead, the line cut. Eli grabbed his shoulder, voice low. "She got out, barely. Neighbor saw her running with the little ones." Marcus's vision tunneled, fury boiling over, his fists slamming into the wall, splintering wood. Hargrove hadn't just struck back. He'd torched everything Marcus had left, the home where Darius grew up, where Nia raised her boys. The radio droned on, the anchor's tone shifting to outrage. Witnesses report seeing sheriff's deputies near the property before the blaze, but Hargrove insists it's retaliation by Kane's criminal network. Marcus paced, breath ragged, the safe house closing in. He'd won his freedom, a tactical triumph, only to lose the last anchor of his past. Nia's face flashed in his mind, her scream as flames swallowed their history, her kids coughing in the smoke. Hargrove wasn't playing defense. He was waging war. Then came the gut punch. The broadcast cut to Hargrove's voice, smug and steady, a recording that turned Marcus's blood cold. "We've uncovered audio of Marcus Kane confessing to the arson. This is a man unhinged, a danger to our community." The station played it, a distorted growl Marcus didn't recognize, words spliced together. "I burned it. Had to send a message." His team froze, eyes darting to him, doubt flickering in their stares. "That's not me," he snapped, voice cutting through the static, but the damage was done. Eli squinted, hand hovering near his holster. "You sure, boss? They've got tech now." Marcus grabbed the radio, smashing it against the floor, shards scattering. "It's a fake. He's turning you against me." The safe house went silent, the team's trust wavering, a crack Hargrove had carved with a lie. Marcus stepped outside, the humid air sticking to his skin, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He'd escaped, rallied his unit, thought he'd shifted the battlefield. But Hargrove had flipped it again, burning his home, framing him as a monster. The news called him a terrorist now, a black man gone rogue, the same tired script they'd used on Darius. Racism wasn't just in the fire. It was in the story they spun, the way they twisted his fight into chaos. He'd won a battle, but Hargrove had raised his world, leaving him isolated, a fugitive even to those who'd broken him free. Nia's voice echoed in his head, a call she'd made months ago, warning him about the town's whispers, the way folks eyed them since Darius started. "College. They don't like us winning, Marcus," she'd said, and he'd brushed it off, thinking his medals, his service, meant something. Now she was homeless, her kids terrified because of him. The burner buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Nia's safe, but they're watching." Relief hit, then dread. Hargrove wasn't done, he'd use her next, bait to drag Marcus back into the open. The team filtered out, Eli last, his gaze heavy. "We're still with you," he said, but the hesitation lingered. A wound, Hargrove's lie had opened. Marcus stared into the oaks, the moss swaying like ghosts, his mind racing. He'd slipped their chains, turned their smug transfer into a rout, but at what cost? His home was ash, his sister a target, his allies wavering under a fabricated confession. Hargrove wasn't just a sheriff, he was a machine, grinding Marcus down with every lever of power he could pull. The protests still roared, a distant hum on the wind, but this strike had personal teeth, a blow to gut him where bullets couldn't reach. He'd thought freedom was a step forward. Now it felt like a trap, every gain shredded by a system that thrived on his pain. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the safe house, and Marcus straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. He'd lost everything but the fight, and that was enough. Hargrove wanted a terrorist. He'd get a soldier, one who'd burned through worse hells than this. The team watched him, waiting, and he nodded once, sharp and sure. "We hit back," he said, voice low, final. They'd torched his past, he'd torched their future. But Hargrove's next move was already in motion, a shadow he couldn't yet see, and it would make this fire look like a spark. "What's your take on this? Did Marcus's escape make him a hero worth rooting for, or did Hargrove's counterstrike prove he's in over his head? Comment 1 if you think Marcus can still win this war. 2 if Hargrove's got him cornered, and hit like if you're stunned by this sheriff's ruthlessness. Subscribe now, because the next part's about to unleash hell. Can Marcus turn the tables on Hargrove's lies, or will his next strike cost him even more than his home? What would you do if the system burned everything you loved? Rain lashed the derelict warehouse on the edge of town, a crumbling shell of rusted beams and shattered windows, the storm's roar swallowing the hum of South Carolina's restless night. Marcus Kane crouched in the shadows, water dripping from his cropped hair, soaking the black jacket he'd scavenged from the safe house. His team flanked him, silent as ghosts, their breath steady despite the thunder rattling the walls. Eli knelt beside him, binoculars pressed to his eyes, tracking a black SUV pulling into the lot outside. "Baxter and Voss," he whispered, voice cutting through the downpour. "Meeting some lowlife, right on schedule." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight, the baton from the van escape still gripped in his fist. This was his move, his chance to hit back. He'd pieced it together from burner phone intel. Baxter and Voss were running side deals, shaking down locals for Hargrove's dirty cash. Tonight, they'd slipped away from the sheriff's watch, thinking the storm would cover their tracks. Marcus had other plans. He'd lost his home, his sister's safety, his team's full trust to Hargrove's lies. Now he'd rip the mask off these killers, show the world what they really were. "Record," he muttered to Tia, a wiry ex-medic with a steady hand, her phone rigged with a mic patched from old Delta gear. She nodded, slipping into position behind a cracked pillar, the device humming to life. The SUV's doors swung open, and Baxter stepped out first, his buzz cut slick with rain, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Voss followed, twitchy as ever, his pistol glinting under a flickering street lamp. A third figure emerged from the shadows, a scrawny dealer with a hood pulled low, his voice lost to the wind as he handed over a wad of cash. Marcus waited, muscles coiled, counting their steps until they clustered near a stack of rotting crates. Then he moved, a blur of motion, his team fanning out like wolves on a hunt. He hit Baxter first, the baton cracking across his knees, dropping him with a howl into the mud. Voss spun, gun rising, but Eli's boot slammed into his wrist, sending the weapon skittering across the wet concrete. Marcus didn't stop. He grabbed Baxter by the collar, yanking him up, slamming him against the SUV's hood, the metal denting under the force. "Talk," he growled, voice low and lethal, rain streaking blood from his knuckles. Baxter spat, a mix of saliva and red, his smirk defiant. "You're dead, Kane. Nobody's buying your shit." Marcus drove a fist into his gut, doubling him over, then wrenched his head back, forcing him to face Tia's lens. "Say it again," he said, louder now, the mic catching every word. Voss thrashed under Eli's grip, cursing, but Tia's camera stayed steady, the red light a silent witness. Baxter's resolve cracked under the next blow, a sharp jab to his ribs that drew a gasp. All right, he wheezed, eyes darting. To Voss, then back to Marcus. We shot the kid 'cause he was there. Black kid, nice house, didn't fit. Hargrove said clean it up, so we did. Voss snarled, lunging against Eli's hold. Shut up, you idiot! But Marcus was on him now, wrenching his arm back until it popped, a scream tearing through the storm. Keep going, Marcus said, voice cold as steel, shoving Voss's face into the mud. Tell them what you told me at the pier. Voss choked, spitting dirt. Called him a thief, said he'd learn his place. Hargrove wanted it quiet. The confession spilled like oil, slick and toxic, every racist slur and boast captured raw on Tia's feed. Marcus stepped back, chest heaving, rain washing the blood from his hands as he signaled Tia to cut it. She uploaded it from the burner, the file racing into the digital ether, a bomb set to detonate. Live in 10, she said, voice steady despite the chaos, and Marcus nodded. Watching Baxter and Voss writhe in the muck, their bravado shattered. He'd beaten them bloody, ripped their truth bare, and sent it to the world. For a moment, he felt the tide shift, the weight of Darius's death lifting just enough to breathe. This was vengeance, a blow Hargrove couldn't dodge. They melted back into the warehouse, leaving the cops groaning in the rain, the SUV's headlights cutting. Through the haze as thunder rolled. Inside, Marcus checked the upload on a cracked laptop, the views climbing fast, 10,000, 20, 50. Comments flooded in, a torrent of outrage and hashtags, justice for Darius trending within the hour. Eli clapped his shoulder, a rare grin breaking through. You got 'em, boss, they're done. Marcus exhaled, the storm's rhythm syncing with his pulse. He'd turned Hargrove's pawns into liabilities, their own words a noose tightening around the sheriff's empire. The protests would roar louder now, the nation watching, and he let himself believe he'd landed a killing strike. But Hargrove didn't bend to pressure. He broke it. Dawn broke grey and heavy, the safe house buzzing with static as a new report crackled over a salvaged radio. Sheriff Dan Hargrove has arrested Nia Kane, sister of fugitive Marcus Kane, on charges of harboring a criminal. She's been transferred to a women's facility known for its harsh conditions. Marcus froze, the air sucked from the room, his sister's name a dagger in his gut. Nia, who'd barely escaped the fire, now locked in a hellhole because of him. The anchor's voice hardened. Reports suggest guards have singled her out, citing her brother's actions. Hargrove calls this a necessary step to restore order. Marcus's vision blurred, fury surging as he smashed the radio against the wall, shards flying. Nia, tough as nails, who'd raised her kids alone after her husband walked out, now a target in a cage where guards could do worse than beat her. He pictured her, wrists cuffed, facing down sneers and fists, her dark eyes defiant but scared. The team watched him, silent, knowing this cut deeper than the arson. He'd hit Baxter and Voss, thought he'd won a round, only for Hargrove to strike his family again, harder, crueler. Racism wasn't just in the confession, it was in the system that let Hargrove weaponize Nia's life to crush him. Eli broke the silence, voice low. We can get her out. Marcus shook his head, pacing the damp floor, boots squelching. Not yet, they'll expect it. He'd stormed the warehouse, turned the cops' words against them, but Hargrove had flipped it, using Nia as bait, knowing Marcus would burn to save her. The video was live, the world raging, but the sheriff didn't care about optics, he cared about control. Marcus grabbed the laptop, refreshing the feed, the views now in the millions, protests flaring nationwide. It was power, but it wasn't enough, not with Nia locked away. Her kids alone, Hargrove's boot on their necks. Hours later, a new blow landed. The radio, patched back together by Tia, sputtered with a fresh broadcast. Sheriff Hargrove has presented evidence to a local judge, dismissing the viral video of officers Baxter and Voss as coerced under duress. The confession has been ruled inadmissible. Marcus's stomach twisted, a bitter laugh escaping. His throat, coerced. He'd broken them, sure, but those words were theirs, spilling free under pressure they'd earned. Hargrove had bribed someone, greased a palm, turned his strike into smoke. The anchor added, protests continue, but legal experts say this weakens any case against the officers. Marcus sank onto a crate, rain drumming the roof, his hands trembling not from cold, but from rage. He'd ambushed them, recorded their filth, sent it global, and Hargrove had shrugged it off, countering with a lie and a sister in chains. The team shifted uneasily, Tia's eyes on the laptop, Eli's on the door. They'd followed him into this, trusted his lead, but now Naya paid the price, and the confession, his ace, was slipping through his fingers. Racism ran deeper than the cops. It was in the judge's gavel, the sheriff's smirk, the system that bent truth to shield its own. The warehouse felt smaller, the storm's howl a mirror to the chaos in his chest. He'd thought he'd turned the tide, hit Hargrove where it hurt, but the sheriff had struck back, personal and precise, proving he'd never let Marcus win clean. Nia's voice rang in his memory, a warning from years ago. They'll take everything if you push too hard. He'd pushed, and they had. But he wasn't done. The video was out. The world was watching, and Hargrove's move had only sharpened his edge. He stood, wiping rain from his face, his team's eyes locking on him. "We're not stopping," he said, voice ablade. "Not until they bleed." The church basement smelled of damp stone and candle wax, a sanctuary carved beneath a clapboard steeple on the edge of South Carolina's restless town. Marcus Kane stood in the flickering glow of a single bulb, his shadow stretching across the cracked concrete floor, his team huddled around a rickety table strewn with maps and burner phones. Rain from the warehouse ambush still clung to his jacket, mixing with the sweat of a man who'd lost too much to stop now. Nia was in a cell, his home ash, his son's killers shielded by a bribed judge. He needed more than fists. He needed her voice to pierce Hargrove's lies. That voice stepped into the room, sharp heels clicking against the stone. Lena Price, a rogue journalist with a reputation for hunting corruption like prey. Lena was a wiry figure, her dark hair pulled tight, eyes glinting with a fire that matched Marcus's own. She slung a laptop bag onto the table, her voice cutting through the murmurs of his team. "You've got the world's attention, Kane, but Hargrove's choking it out. We need proof he's dirty, not just his goons." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight, the weight of Nia's arrest pressing harder with every hour. He'd ambushed Baxter and Voss, ripped their confession raw, but the sheriff had flipped it, locked his sister away, and buried the truth under a judge's gavel. Lena was his shot to dig deeper, to turn whispers into a roar. "What have you got?" he asked, voice low, steady despite the storm in his chest. She cracked open the laptop, fingers flying across the keys, pulling up files that glowed harsh against the dimness. "Hargrove's been covering hate crimes for years," she said, scrolling through scanned reports, yellowed pages digitized from dusty archives. Black families run out of town, beatings swept under rugs, evidence torched. He's got a trail of bodies and a payroll of dirty cops. Marcus leaned in, eyes tracing the names, dates, a litany of lives crushed under Hargrove's boot. One caught his breath. A kid, 16, beaten dead in a ditch, case closed as self-defense by Hargrove's word alone. Darius's face flashed in his mind, merging with that ghost, and his fists clenched, knuckles whitening against the table's edge. Tia rigged a live feed from the basement, patching the laptop to a signal booster scavenged from their gear, the church's ancient Wi-Fi groaning under the load. "We go now," Lena said, voice sharp, "before he buries this too." Marcus nodded, stepping back as she hit record, her face filling the screen, the basement's shadows framing her like a battlefield banner. "This is Lena Price streaming unfiltered truth. Sheriff Dan Hargrove's a monster hiding behind a badge. Here's the proof. Decades of hate crimes he's erased, families he's broken, lives he's stolen." She flipped through the files, each page a gut punch, her voice rising with every name. "Darius Kane wasn't the first, but he damn well won't be the last unless we stop him." Marcus watched the views climb, thousands turning to tens of thousands, the feed bouncing across platforms unstoppable. Protests erupted nationwide, the radio crackling with reports. Crowds flood Charleston, Atlanta, D.C., chanting for Marcus Kane and justice. His chest tightened, a flicker of hope piercing the rage. He'd allied with Lena, turned her lens into a weapon, and now the world was waking up, Hargrove's empire trembling under the weight of its own filth. For a moment, he let himself believe. It was enough that this broadcast would crack the sheriff's armor, force the system to bend where fists couldn't reach. But Hargrove didn't flinch at spotlights. He shattered them. The radio shifted, a new voice cutting through, smug and calculated. Breaking news. A race riot has erupted in downtown, led by Marcus Kane's followers. Businesses burn, police under attack. Marcus froze, the basement. Air turning thick, his team's eyes darting to him. "That's not us," Eli snapped, grabbing the radio, but the report rolled on. Sheriff Hargrove blames Kane for inciting violence, calling it a coordinated assault on order. Marcus's stomach twisted, realization dawning like a blade. Hargrove had staged it, hired thugs to pose as black protesters, turning his broadcast into a boomerang. The feed flickered, comments shifting from support to chaos. "Kane's a terrorist." "He's burning the town," Lena cursed, slamming the laptop shut, but the damage was done. Sirens wailed outside, closer now, the church trembling as boots pounded the streets. Then the blast hit, a deafening roar that shook the walls, dust raining from the rafters. Marcus dove for cover, pulling Tia down as glass shattered upstairs, the explosion's heat licking through the stairwell. "Stations." "Hit!" Eli shouted, coughing through the smoke, the radio confirming it. Channel 9's broadcast hub bombed, multiple injuries reported. Lena staggered up, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, her voice hoarse. "They got me too. Marcus's—" Mind raced, piecing it through the haze. Hargrove hadn't just framed the riots. He'd struck Lena's base, silencing her signal, painting Marcus as the mastermind. He'd won the airwaves, turned the nation's eyes against him. But the sheriff wasn't done. The radio crackled again, a chilling update. Hargrove confirms. The abduction of Marcus Kane's nephew, 8-year-old Jayden, from a safe house. "This is Kane's war," he says. Marcus's breath stopped, his vision tunneling, Jayden's gap-toothed grin flashing in his mind. Nia's boy snatched from hiding, a knife twisted deeper than the fire, the jail, the lies. He lunged for the table, maps scattering, his roar echoing off the stone. "They've got Jayden!" Eli grabbed his arm, holding him back, voice steady, but urgent. "We'll find him, boss, but we gotta move smart." Marcus shook him off, pacing the rubble-strewn floor, his hands trembling with a fury he couldn't cage. He'd teamed with Lena, broadcast Hargrove's sins, sparked a fire across the country, only for the sheriff to turn it into ash, injuring Lena, snatching Jayden, framing him for chaos. Racism wasn't just in the files, it was in the bombs, the kidnappings, the way Hargrove wielded power to crush a black man's fight. The basement was a war zone now, the team scrambling to salvage gear, the air thick with dust and despair. Lena wiped blood from her face, her laptop cracked but alive, her eyes burning. "I'm not out," she said, voice raw. "We hit harder." Marcus nodded, his pulse a drumbeat, Jayden's name a chant in his skull. He'd thought the broadcast was a triumph, a crack in Hargrove's wall, but the sheriff had escalated, personal and savage, proving he'd burn the world to keep Marcus down. The protests raged on, a distant roar through the shattered windows, but now they were a double-edged sword twisted against him. Tia patched a signal, pulling up grainy footage from a street cam. Masked men torching shops, their moves too clean, too staged. "Hargrove's plants," she muttered, and Marcus's fists clenched, knuckles splitting anew. He'd exposed the sheriff's past, rallied the nation, only to hand Hargrove a script to rewrite him as the villain. Jayden's abduction was the real blow. A child's life dangled as bait, a message carved in blood. "Push me and I'll take everything." Marcus turned to his team, their faces grim but resolute. "We get him back," he said, voice a blade cutting through the chaos. "Then we end this." The church trembled as sirens closed in, the night alive with Hargrove's wrath. Marcus had struck deep, thought he'd shifted the war. But the sheriff had countered with a brutality that dwarfed the warehouse ambush. Nia in jail, Jayden gone, Lena's station in ruins, the protests warped into a lie. It was a barrage Marcus hadn't braced for. He'd allied with a voice, turned it into a megaphone, but Hargrove had silenced it with fire and fear, proving the system didn't just protect him, it fueled him. Marcus wiped dust from his eyes, his resolve hardening. This wasn't a setback, it was a call to war, and he'd answer with everything he had left. What's your verdict? Does Marcus's alliance with Lena make him a mastermind worth cheering, or has Hargrove's retaliation pushed him past the brink? Comment 1 if you think Marcus can still save Jayden, 2 if Hargrove's too ruthless to beat, and smash like if this twist left you reeling. Subscribe now, because the next chapter's about to explode. Will Marcus rescue his nephew and turn this chaos back on Hargrove, or has the sheriff's next move already sealed his fate? How far would you fight if they took your family too? Fog rolled thick over the swamp, a gray shroud swallowing South Carolina's coastal lowlands, the air heavy with the stench of mud and decay. Marcus Kane crouched behind a cypress stump, his boots sinking into the muck, the faint hum of cicadas, masking his ragged breaths. His team fanned out through the mist, shadows among the gnarled trees, their silenced rifles glinting faintly under a moonless sky. Hargrove's hunting retreat loomed ahead, a ramshackle cabin perched on stilts above the water, its lights flickering like a predator's eyes. Jayden was in there, Marcus's 8-year-old nephew, snatched by the sheriff's goons after the church basement broadcast. Every second burned, but Marcus moved with the precision of a soldier, not the panic of an uncle. Eli had tracked the kidnappers here, piecing it from a burner call intercepted hours ago. Kids at the swamp lodge, sheriff's orders. Marcus's chest tightened, Jayden's gap-toothed grin flashing in his mind. A kid who'd clung to him after Naya's house burned, now a pawn in Hargrove's war. The team closed in, Tia cutting the perimeter wire, Eli scouting the guards, 2 at the door, 1 on the roof, all armed with shotguns. Marcus signaled, a sharp flick of his hand, and they struck. Tia's silenced shot dropped the rooftop man, his body slumping into the fog, while Eli rushed the door, snapping a guard's neck with a twist. Marcus hit the second, a baton to the skull, the crack muffled by the swamp's damp air. Inside, the cabin reeked of stale beer and gun oil, its wooden walls plastered with hunting trophies, antlers casting jagged shadows. Jayden sat tied to a chair in the corner, his small frame trembling, duct tape over his mouth, eyes wide with terror. Marcus's heart lurched, but he kept moving, slicing the ropes with a knife from his boot, scooping the boy into his arms. "I've got you," he whispered, voice steady despite the storm in his gut, peeling the tape free as Jayden whimpered, clinging to him. 2 more of Hargrove's men burst from a back room, pistols raised, but Marcus was faster, hurling the knife into one's throat, then tackling the other, snapping his arm with a brutal twist. Blood sprayed, the man's scream cut short as Marcus drove a knee into his chest, silencing him. They bolted, Jayden cradled against his shoulder, the team, covering their retreat through the fog. Marcus's lungs burned, the swamp sucking at his boots, but he pushed harder, the boy's weight a lifeline pulling him forward. Eli took point, guiding them to a stolen truck hidden in the reeds, its engine rumbling awake as they piled in. "Clear," Tia called, slamming the door, and Marcus floored it, tires spinning through the mud, the cabin shrinking in the rear view. Jayden sobbed against his chest, small hands gripping his jacket, and Marcus's jaw clenched, relief warring with rage. He'd saved him, snatched him from Hargrove's claws, a fleeting triumph that felt like sunlight piercing the storm. For a moment he thought he'd turned the tide, broken the sheriff's grip on his family. But Hargrove didn't let victories stand. The truck hit a dirt road as dawn broke, gray light filtering through the pines, when the radio crackled with a voice that turned Marcus's blood cold. "Sheriff Dan Hargrove has declared Marcus Kane a cop killer after 2 deputies were found, dead at a rural outpost. A statewide manhunt is underway with orders to shoot on sight." Marcus's grip tightened on the wheel, the words sinking like lead. Those weren't deputies. They were Hargrove's hired muscle, the ones he'd dropped to save Jayden. The sheriff had flipped it, spun the rescue into a massacre, painting him as a monster to justify the hunt. Eli cursed, slamming a fist against the dash while Tia patched a signal, pulling up a live feed on her cracked phone. "Drones are up," she said, voice tight, the screen showing buzzing specks over the swamp, red dots tracking their heat. Marcus swerved off-road, the truck bouncing through underbrush, Jayden's whimpers rising as branches scraped the sides. "Hold on," he muttered. Eyes darting to the sky, the drone's hum growing louder, a mechanical swarm closing in. He'd won Jayden back, thought he'd outrun Hargrove's reach, but the sheriff had escalated, turning a family rescue into a death sentence, the system's racism fueling every lie. The first shot came from above, a sniper's round punching through the windshield, glass exploding inward, grazing Marcus's shoulder. Blood welled hot under his shirt, pain flaring, but he kept driving, weaving through the trees as Jayden screamed. "Down!" Eli shouted, pulling the boy to the floor, shielding him as another bullet tore through the roof, splintering metal. Marcus's vision blurred, adrenaline surging, his Delta instincts kicking in. He spotted a ravine ahead, a narrow drop masked by fog, and gunned it, the truck lurching over the edge, crashing into the muddy bank below. The impact jolted his bones, Jayden's cries piercing the chaos, but they were alive, hidden from the drone's eyes. They scrambled out, Marcus hoisting Jayden onto his back, blood dripping from his shoulder, soaking the boy's shirt. Eli and Tia flanked him, rifles up, the swamp swallowing their tracks as the drones buzzed overhead, circling blind. "They'll bring ground teams," Eli said, voice low, scanning the mist. Marcus nodded, his breath ragged, pain pulsing with every step. He'd saved Jayden, a victory carved in blood and mud, but Hargrove's manhunt was a beast unleashed, drones and snipers just the start. The radio had called him a cop killer, a label that stuck like tar, the world turning against him faster than he could run. Hours later, crouched in a hollow under a fallen oak, Marcus patched his wound with a strip of his shirt. Jayden curled. Against him, shivering but quiet. The team kept watch, the swamp's stillness a fragile shield. He'd thought the rescue was a turning point, a crack in Hargrove's armor. But the sheriff had countered with a lie so bold, it rewrote reality. Those dead men weren't cops, they were thugs, but Hargrove's word was law, and Marcus's black skin made the story fit. Racism wasn't just in the bullets. It was in the hunt, the way they hunted him like an animal. No questions, no mercy. Tia's phone buzzed, a weak signal pulling up a new broadcast, the anchor's voice grim. Officers Trent Baxter and Kyle Voss, recovered from their injuries, are leading the manhunt for Marcus Kane, vowing to bring him down after the alleged murders. Marcus's stomach twisted, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. Baxter and Voss, the bastards who'd shot Darius, now back on his trail, their broken bones healed enough to hunt him through the swamp. He'd beaten them bloody at the warehouse, thought he'd buried them with their own words, but Hargrove had resurrected them, turned his tormentors into executioners. Jayden stirred, his small voice trembling. "Uncle Marcus, are they gonna get us?" Marcus pulled him closer, ignoring the throb in his shoulder, his voice firm despite the chaos. "Not while I'm here, kid." But the doubt gnawed, sharp and cold. He'd stormed the cabin, freed Jayden, outrun the first wave, only for Hargrove to unleash a manhunt that dwarfed the fire, the jail, the riots. The drones faded, their hum retreating, but the ground teams would come, Baxter and Voss at the helm, their hatred of fuel Hargrove had stoked. The swamp was a battlefield now, and Marcus was bleeding, cornered, a soldier with a child to protect. Eli crouched beside him, rifle resting on his knee, eyes scanning the fog. "They're closing in, boss. We need a plan." Marcus nodded, his mind racing, tracing the swamp's twists, plotting a path through the mire. He'd saved Jayden, a triumph snatched from Hargrove's grip, but the cost was steep. A wound. A manhunt. His enemies reborn with a vengeance. The sheriff hadn't just struck back. He'd turned Marcus's fight into a death march, proving the system would kill him before it bent. Racism ran through every drone, every broadcast, every badge that hunted him now. He shifted Jayden's weight, his resolve hardening. "We move at dusk," he said, voice ablade. "They want a killer. I'll give them one." The swamp stretched endless around them, fog curling like smoke, the air thick with the promise of blood. Marcus had broken Hargrove's hold on Jayden, thought he'd reclaimed a piece of his soul, but the sheriff had countered with a war that made the warehouse look tame. Baxter and Voss were coming, their footsteps a drumbeat in the mist, and Marcus knew this wasn't just a hunt. It was an execution. He'd won a battle, but the war had shifted, and Hargrove's next move would test every ounce of his Delta steel. The Charleston rally pulsed with raw energy, a sea of bodies spilling across the city square, their chants echoing off the brick facades under a bruised dusk sky. Marcus Kane emerged from the swamp's shadows, blood seeping from the sniper wound. In his shoulder, Jayden clinging to his back, small arms locked around his neck. His team flanked him, rifles stowed but ready, their boots caked with mud as they pushed through the crowd. Protesters parted, faces alight with awe and fury, signs scrawled with "Justice for Darius" and "Free Marcus" swaying above their heads. News vans ringed the square, cameras swiveling, their lenses glinting like vultures' eyes, and Marcus knew this was his moment, his last stand to shift the war. He climbed onto a makeshift stage, a overturned crate draped with a banner. Jayden trembling beside him, the boy's eyes wide but trusting. The crowd hushed, 1,000 breaths held as Marcus faced the cameras, blood streaking his torn shirt, his voice cutting through the humid air. They killed my son. They burned my home. They took my nephew. I'm Marcus Kane, Delta Force, 20 years serving this country, and they're hunting me like a dog. His words landed like blows, the crowd erupting, fists pumping, their roar shaking the pavement. I'm not running anymore. I'm here, federal agents. Take me if you want, but give me justice. He raised his hands, palms open, a soldier's, surrender laced with defiance. Federal agents in black vests surged forward, their movements sharp, mechanical, cuffs snapping around Marcus's wrists as Eli and Tia stepped back, shielding Jayden. The cameras rolled, broadcasting live, the nation watching as Marcus stared down the lenses, unbowed despite the blood, the chains, the weight of Hargrove's manhunt. Darius deserved better, he said, voice steady, final, as they dragged him toward an armored van. The crowd surged, chants swelling into a war cry, "Let him go! Justice now!" Protests exploded across the country, the radio crackling with reports. Rallies in New York, Chicago, LA, millions demanding Kane's release and Hargrove's head. Marcus's chest burned, not from the wound, but from a fleeting hope. He'd turned himself in, forced the Fed's hand, and the world was rising with him. The van rolled through Charleston's chaotic streets, tires humming over asphalt slick with sweat and rage, Marcus shackled in the back, agents silent around. He'd surrendered. A calculated gamble to shift the fight from swamps to courtrooms, trusting the protests to pressure the feds into digging. Hours later, a crackle broke the silence, an agent's radio spitting news. FBI launching probe into Sheriff Hargrove after Kane's statement. Evidence of corruption mounting. Marcus's lips twitched, a grim satisfaction settling in. He'd cracked the system open, turned Hargrove's hunt into a spotlight on his crimes. For a moment, he thought he'd won, that justice might claw through the muck, that Darius's death would mean something. But Hargrove didn't bow to scrutiny. He broke it. The van jolted as night fell, a new broadcast cutting through, the anchor's voice tight with shock. Sheriff Hargrove survives an assassination attempt outside his precinct. He accuses Marcus Kane's terror cell of the attack, claiming it proves his danger. Marcus's stomach sank, the agent's eyes hardening, their grips tightening. On rifles. Bullshit, he muttered, voice low, but the radio rolled on. Hargrove's injuries are minor, but he's doubled down, calling for Kane's execution. Federal custody has shifted. He's now in solitary pending investigation. The van swerved, rerouting to a black site, its steel doors slamming shut behind him. The cell a concrete box colder than the swamp. Marcus slumped against the wall, cuffs biting his wrists, blood crusting over his shoulder, the air thick with mildew and despair. He'd surrendered, rallied the nation, forced a probe, only for Hargrove to flip it with a staged bullet, a lie so bold it turned the feds against him. Racism wasn't just in the manhunt, it was in the sheriff's smirk, the way he twisted. Marcus's fight into terrorism, a black man's defiance branded as chaos. The cell's silence pressed in, broken only by a faint hum from a vent, but his mind raced, replaying the broadcast. Hargrove had faked it, staged the shot. knowing. The system would swallow it whole, shield him while it crushed Marcus deeper. Hours crawled by, the wound throbbing, Jayden's safe return a flicker of light in the dark. Then the vent buzzed louder, a guard's voice filtering through, low and urgent. Church bombing in Charleston. Cartel hit. 50 dead. Hargrove's, pinning it on you. Marcus's breath stopped, his fists clenching, the words a sledgehammer to his gut. A church. 50 lives. He pictured the steeple from the basement, the candles, the hope, now ash and blood. Hargrove hadn't just countered. He'd escalated to genocide, hiring killers to bomb a black sanctuary, framing Marcus as the mastermind. The guard added, "Feds bought it, you're done." Marcus sank to the floor, concrete biting his knees, his mind spinning through the wreckage. He'd stormed the square, surrendered live, sparked a probe that shook Hargrove's throne, only for the sheriff to bury it under bodies, a massacre pinned on a man in chains. The nation's roar faded, twisted into fear, the protests now a funeral dirge. Racism ran through every bomb fragment, every broadcast, every badge that nodded at Hargrove's lie. Jayden was safe, but Nia was still caged, and now 50 souls were gone, their blood on Marcus's name. He'd thought he'd shifted the war, but Hargrove had turned it into a slaughter, proving he'd kill a city to keep Marcus down. The cells. Walls loomed, the silence a weight heavier than the cuffs, but Marcus's eyes burned, tracing the cracks like battle lines. He'd given himself up, trusted the feds, rallied millions, only to hand Hargrove a script to rewrite him as a butcher. The church bombing was a gut punch, a child's scream, a mother's wail, all laid at his feet by a man who'd never face a mirror. He'd won a fleeting victory, forced the probe, but Hargrove's counterstrike was a monster, a cartel's fire unleashed to drown his truth. The feds turned hostile, their boots echoing down the hall, and Marcus knew solitary was just the start. They'd bury him next. Eli's voice echoed in his memory, a warning from the swamp. They'll come for us all if we don't stop him. Marcus had stopped running, faced them head-on, but Hargrove had escalated beyond bullets, beyond jails, into mass murder. The team was out there, Jayden with them, but Nia was still locked away, and now Charleston mourned 50 more because of him. He rose, pacing the cell, blood dripping anew from his shoulder, his resolve hardening. He'd cracked the system, thought he'd won the nation's ear, but Hargrove had silenced it with bodies. This wasn't over. It was a call to break free, to turn this lie into a reckoning. What's your take on this spiral? Did Marcus's surrender prove he's a hero fighting for justice, or has Hargrove's twisted game made him a scapegoat too, deep to climb out? Comment 1 if you think Marcus can still turn this nightmare around, 2 if Hargrove's massacre has broken him for good, and hit like if this sheriff's evil left you speechless. Subscribe now because the next part's about to ignite. Can Marcus escape this black site and expose Hargrove's blood-soaked lie, or will the feds bury him before he gets the chance? What would you risk to prove the truth when the world's turned against you? The federal black site was a steel fortress buried in South Carolina's coastal pines, its walls cold and unyielding, the air thick with the tang of bleach and despair. Marcus Kane sat shackled in solitary, a 6-foot cube of concrete, his shoulder, wound festering under a blood-crusted bandage, the church bombing's weight crushing his chest. 50 dead, their screams pinned on him by Hargrove's lie, a cartel hit twisted into his legacy. The feds had swallowed it, their eyes hard when they'd dragged him here, cuffs biting his wrists, the cell's silence a noose tightening with every hour. He'd surrendered in Charleston, sparked a probe, thought he'd shifted the war, but Hargrove had countered with slaughter, burying Marcus under a mountain of blood he didn't spill. Footsteps echoed down the hall, sharp and familiar, cutting through the stillness. The cell door creaked open, and Eli stepped in, his scarred face shadowed under a fed's cap, a knife glinting in his hand. Marcus tensed, instinct flaring, but Eli's voice was low, urgent. "We're getting you out, boss." He'd infiltrated, turned a guard's uniform into a key, his Delta loyalty unbroken despite the lies. He sliced the cuffs free, metal clattering, to the floor and pressed the knife into Marcus's palm. 2 guards outside, then the gate. Move fast. Marcus nodded, flexing his hands. Blood rushing back, the beast in his chest roaring awake. Hargrove thought this box was his end. Eli had just cracked it open. They moved like shadows, Marcus trailing Eli through the dim corridor, the knife warm against his skin. The first guard loomed at a corner, radio crackling, and Marcus struck, blade sinking into the man's throat. A gurgle swallowed by the concrete. The second swung a baton, catching Eli's arm, but Marcus lunged, snapping the guard's neck. With a twist, his body crumpling silent. Blood slicked his hands, the old rhythm of war pulsing through him, every kill a step toward freedom. They hit the gate, Eli hot-wiring a panel, sparks flying as it groaned open. The night air hitting Marcus like a slap, cool and briny, the pines swaying under a starless sky. He bolted, Eli at his heels, the black site's alarms shrieking behind. Them, red lights slicing the dark. They reached a stolen sedan hidden in the brush, Marcus sliding behind the wheel, tires spinning as they tore down a dirt track. "Tia's got a feed ready," Eli said, breath ragged, pulling a burner phone. "Lena's alive, hold up with proof." Marcus's pulse jumped, hope flickering through the rage. Lena, presumed dead after the station bombing, had survived, her evidence a lifeline. He'd escaped, turned Hargrove's trap into a breakout, and now he had a shot to flip the church lie, prove the sheriff's hands were redder than his own. They hit a roadside shack by dawn, a rotting shell of plywood and tin. Tia waiting with a laptop patched to a satellite dish. Lena's face flickered on the screen, bruised but fierce, her voice cutting through static. "Hargrove owns the cartel. I've got bank records, calls, proof he paid for the church hit." Marcus leaned in, eyes tracing the numbers, the dates. A trail of death bought with dirty cash. Tia hacked a newsfeed, hijacking a national broadcast, Lena's words spilling live. Sheriff Dan Hargrove ordered the Charleston bombing, framed Marcus Kane. Here's the truth they buried. The screen flashed documents irrefutable, and Marcus exhaled. The nation's trust swinging back, protests reigniting with a roar he could feel through the shack's thin walls. For a moment he thought he'd won, turned the black site into a launchpad, Lena's proof a sledgehammer to Hargrove's lies. The feed hit millions, views soaring, the world waking to the sheriff's rot. Jayden was safe with the team, Nia still caged but alive, and now this broadcast was a beacon, a chance, to clear his name, to make Darius's death a rallying cry. He'd escaped, struck back, thought he'd shifted the war's tide at last. But Hargrove didn't crumble under truth. He crushed it. The shack's radio crackled, a new report slicing through, the anchor's voice trembling. "A gas explosion has leveled the women's prison holding Nia Kane. Dozens dead, including inmates and staff. Sheriff Hargrove claims Marcus Kane orchestrated it from hiding." Marcus's world tilted, the air sucked from the room, his knees buckling as he gripped the table, wood splintering under his fists. Nia, his sister, tough as steel, who'd survived the fire, now gone in a blast Hargrove blamed on him. He pictured her defiant in her cell, then nothing, swallowed by fire and rubble, dozens more with her, their screams a chorus he'd carry forever. Eli grabbed his shoulder, voice low. "They're lying, boss, it's him." But the radio rolled on, Hargrove's smug tone breaking through. "Kane's a terrorist, striking from the shadows. This proves it." Marcus roared, hurling the radio against the wall, shards flying, his vision blurring with rage and grief. Tia's phone buzzed, pulling up a live feed, the prison's wreckage smoking on screen, bodies under sheets, survivors wailing. "They're saying you rigged it," she whispered, voice breaking, and Marcus's stomach twisted, bile rising. He'd escaped, broadcast the truth, thought he'd turned the nation's eyes, only for Hargrove to bury it under Nia's grave. A massacre pinned on a man who'd just broken free. Racism wasn't just in the lie, it was in the blast, the way Hargrove wielded death to silence a black man's fight, to turn his sister's life into a weapon against him. Then Lena's voice cut through, faint but fierce, the shack's signal, flickering back. "I'm captured, Marcus. They've got me, but the proof's out. Don't stop." The feed died, her bruised face vanishing, and Marcus's breath caught, a new wound tearing open. Lena, his voice, his ally, snatched by Hargrove's claws, her survival a fleeting spark snuffed out. He'd thought she was safe, thought Broadcast was his triumph, but the sheriff had countered with a double blow. Nia dead, Lena taken, the world twisted against him again. The team froze. Eli's eyes on the floor, tears on the screen, their silence a weight heavier than the shack's sagging roof. Marcus staggered outside, the dawn air cold against his sweat-soaked skin, pines looming like sentinels over a battlefield. He'd broken from the black site, killed to escape, sent Lena's truth live, only for Hargrove to burn Nia's prison, snatch Lena, and frame him for mass murder. The nation's trust, so briefly his, was ash now, protests faltering under the weight of this lie. Jayden was safe, but Nia was gone, Lena captured, and Marcus stood alone, a fugitive branded with a slaughter he didn't commit. Racism ran through every flame, every broadcast, every badge that hunted him, a system that thrived on his pain. Eli followed, rifle slung over his shoulder, voice steady but grim. "We've got a safe spot, boss. Regroup, then hit back." Marcus nodded, wiping blood from his hands, his mind racing through the wreckage. He'd escaped, turned Hargrove's cage into a platform, broadcast a truth that shook the world, but the sheriff had escalated, personal and genocidal, proving he'd killed dozens to keep Marcus down. The shack trembled as distant sirens wailed, the hunt closing in again. He'd won a fleeting victory, thought he'd cleared his name, but Hargrove's counterstrike was a nightmare, Nia's death a scar he'd carry into the next fight. "We move now," he said, voice a blade, cutting through the dawn. "This ends when he does." The pines stretched endless around them, the air thick with the promise of blood, the shack a fragile shield against a war spiraling out of control. Marcus had broken free, sent Lena's proof global, thought he'd shifted the battlefield, but Hargrove had turned it into a graveyard, Nia's prison a tomb, Lena a hostage, his name a curse. The feds were coming, the nation turning, and Marcus knew this wasn't just a fight anymore. It was survival. A soldier against a system that wouldn't stop until he was dust. He'd won a battle, but Hargrove's next move loomed, a shadow, darker than the pines, and Marcus braced for the chaos it would unleash. Charleston's streets blazed under a noon sun, a city unraveling into chaos, smoke curling from torched cars, the air thick with the acrid sting of tear gas and rage. Marcus Kane stormed through the fray, his shoulder wound a dull throb under. A fresh bandage, his team weaving behind him like shadows through the riot's pulse. He'd escaped the black site, broadcast Lena's proof, lost Nia to Hargrove's prison blast, and now he aimed for the sheriff's heart. A sprawling mansion on the city's edge, a fortress of wealth built on blood. Lena was inside, captured, after her feed, and Marcus would tear it down to get her back, to turn Hargrove's empire into ash. The mansion loomed beyond a wrought-iron gate, its white columns gleaming against the chaos, guards patrolling with rifles slung low. Marcus crouched in an alley, Eli at his side, Tia rigging a drone with a smoke canister scavenged from their gear. "6 on the perimeter, more inside," Eli whispered, binoculars pressed to his eyes, sweat beading on his scarred brow. Marcus nodded, his knife from the black site gripped tight, its blade still stained with guard blood. Jayden was safe, hidden with allies, but Nia's death burned in his gut, Lena's capture a fresh wound. He'd lost too much to falter now. This was war, and Hargrove's lair was the battlefield. Tia launched the drone, its hum swallowed by the distant roar of protests, smoke billowing as it swooped over the gate, choking the guards in a grey haze. Marcus moved, a blur of motion, scaling the fence with Eli, Tia covering their rear with a silenced rifle. He hit the ground rolling, knife sinking into a guard's chest, blood spurting hot as the man crumpled. Eli took another, a chokehold dropping him silent, and they breached the mansion's side door, wood splintering under Marcus's boot. Inside, the air was cool, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers, a stark contrast to the city's inferno. Lena's voice echoed faint from below, a basement call, and Marcus's pulse surged, leading them down a spiral stair. The basement was a concrete vault, its walls lined with locked cabinets, the stench of mildew mixing with fear. Lena sat bound, to a chair, her face bruised, one eye swollen shut, but her jaw set defiant as Hargrove's men loomed over her, pistols drawn. Marcus struck first, knife slashing a throat, blood arcing across the floor while Eli's silenced shot dropped another, the body slumping against a wall. Tia freed Lena, slicing ropes with a blade, her voice steady. "We've got you." Lena staggered up, grabbing a fallen pistol, her breath ragged but fierce. "Broadcast's ready," she rasped, pointing to a laptop rigged with cartel proof, still live from her capture. Marcus kicked the laptop to life, Lena's voice spilling out, raw and unfiltered. "Hargrove paid the cartel to bomb the church, the prison. I'm here alive with the truth." Tia patched it to the feed, the signal blasting global, views soaring as Marcus dragged a dying guard's radio, hearing the nation erupt. Troops deploying to Charleston, protests surging. The mansion shook, windows rattling as crowds breached. The streets outside, their chants a thunderous wave. He'd freed Lena, turned her capture into a weapon, broadcast Hargrove's rot live, and for a moment he felt the war shift. The sheriff's throne cracking under the world's gaze, but Hargrove didn't yield to cracks, he shattered them. The radio crackled, a new voice cutting through, cold and final. "Sheriff Hargrove has escaped custody, detonating the Ashley River Bridge to trap Marcus Kane in Charleston. He claims Kane's a warlord seizing the city." Marcus's stomach dropped, the mansion's walls trembling as an explosion roared outside, the blast's echo rolling through the chaos. He rushed to a window, glass streaked with soot, seeing the bridge collapse in a fireball, cutting off escape, trapping him in a burning city. The feed flickered, news shifting. Military mobilized, Baxter and Voss leading a militia to restore order, targeting black neighborhoods. Marcus's fists clenched, blood dripping anew from his shoulder, rage boiling as Lena gripped the laptop, her voice hoarse. "He's turning this into a slaughter." Eli scanned the streets, rifle up, the horizon alight with flames, sirens, screaming. Hargrove had fled, blown the bridge, framed Marcus as a tyrant and unleashed Baxter and Voss, their racist venom now a militia's fuel. The broadcast had shaken the nation, sparked troops, but the sheriff had countered personal and genocidal, trapping Marcus in a war zone where his own people would bleed. Racism wasn't just in the blast, it was in the militia, the way they'd torch black homes to restore order, pinning it on him. Tia's drone buzzed back, its feed showing armed men in pickup trucks, faces masked, pouring into the city's south side, Molotovs flying. "They're Hargroves," she said, voice tight, and Marcus's mind raced, tracing the sheriff's playbook. He'd freed Lena, turned her proof into a global cry, thought he'd toppled Hargrove's empire, only for the sheriff to escape, rig the bridge, and unleash a purge. The radio spat again, a general's voice, clipped and stern. "Airstrike, authorized on Charleston, classified as a rebel purge. Evacuate or neutralize." Marcus froze, the words a sledgehammer, his breath catching as Eli cursed, slamming a fist against the wall. The mansion's chandelier swayed, dust raining from the ceiling, the city's pulse a drumbeat of panic outside. Marcus had stormed in, saved Lena, broadcast the truth, only for Hargrove to flip it into a military nightmare, an airstrike looming over a trapped city, his name the excuse. Jayden was safe, but Nia was ash. Lena barely standing, and now Charleston faced annihilation. Black lives the target under a rebel lie. Racism ran through every jet engine, every militia torch, every badge that nodded at Hargrove's escape. The team gathered, eyes on Marcus, their silence a plea for a plan, but the general's voice lingered, a death knell he couldn't outrun. Lena limped to his side, pistol trembling in her grip, her voice a rasp. "We've got minutes. Fight. Or run." Marcus stared out the window, flames licking the skyline, the bridge's wreckage a scar cutting him off. He'd cracked Hargrove's empire, thought he'd won the nation's ear, but the sheriff had turned it into a trap, a city burning, jets screaming overhead. Baxter and Voss were out there, their militia a blade aimed at his people, and the airstrike was Hargrove's final play, a purge to bury him under rubble. He'd saved Lena, struck deep, but the cost was a war he couldn't control, a city teetering on genocide. Eli slung his rifle, voice low. "We hit the streets, boss. Disrupt them." Marcus nodded, wiping sweat from his brow, his mind racing through the chaos. He'd stormed the mansion, freed Lena, broadcast a truth that shook the world, only for Hargrove to escape, blow the bridge, and call in jets, framing him as the warlord. The protests raged, troops deployed, but now it was a fight for survival, a soldier against a system that had killed millions to keep him down. "We move now," he said, voice a blade cutting through the smoke. "They want a war? They've got one." The mansion trembled as jets roared closer. The city a battlefield trapped in Hargrove's web, the air thick with the promise of blood and ash. Marcus had broken the sheriff's hold on Lena, turned his lair into a platform, thought he'd shifted. The war's tide, but Hargrove had countered with a vengeance that dwarfed the prison blast. Baxter and Voss's militia marched, the airstrike loomed, and Marcus stood in the eye, a soldier with a city to save, a truth to wield, and a fight. He couldn't lose. He'd won a battle, but Hargrove's next move was a storm, and Marcus braced for the chaos it would unleash. Charleston's skyline burned under a blood-red dusk, the air thick with smoke, and the piercing wail of airstrike sirens, a city trapped in Hargrove's chaos. Marcus Kane stood on a crumbling rooftop, a shattered tenement overlooking the south side, his shoulder wound seeping through a torn shirt. Jayden huddled behind him with Lena and the team. The Ashley River Bridge smoldered in the distance, its wreckage a cage locking them in, jets screaming overhead, their shadows slicing the haze. Protesters clashed below, makeshift shields of trashcan lids and signs buckling under militia fire. Baxter and Voss's men torching black neighborhoods with Molotovs, their racist fury unleashed under Hargrove's lie. Marcus gripped a megaphone scavenged from the mansion, his voice booming over the chaos, cutting through the siren's shriek. "Stop! Listen to me!" Heads turned, protesters pausing mid-throw, militia men faltering, their flames flickering as his words hit. "They want us to lose control, don't give them that." Lena patched a feed from her cracked laptop, broadcasting live from a drone Tia piloted, Marcus's battered face filling screens worldwide. "They killed my son, burned my home, bombed a church, a prison. Now they're framing me for this. Don't let them win." The crowd shifted, rage tethering to his command, a fragile order forming as they rallied behind him. He climbed onto a fallen barricade, concrete rough under his boots, the city's pulse a drumbeat beneath him. "Hargrove, paid the cartel. I've got proof." Lena's feed flashed the bank records, calls undeniable, and the nation roared back, protest surging anew, millions watching. Marcus's chest burned, not from the wound, but from a flicker of triumph. He'd stormed the mansion, freed Lena, turned her truth into a global cry, and now he held Charleston's fate, a soldier leading a city against genocide. For a moment, he thought he'd turned the tide, stopped the purge, forced the world to see. But Hargrove didn't bow to truth. He broke it. Marcus spotted them through the smoke. Baxter and Voss climbing the fire escape, their militia goons trailing, rifles glinting under the dying sun. He dropped the megaphone, drawing his knife, signaling Eli to cover Jayden as Tia aimed her rifle. Baxter hit the roof first, his buzz cut slick with sweat, a shotgun raised, Voss behind him, pistol trembling, but eager. "End of the line, Kane," Baxter snarled, firing a blast that splintered the barricade, concrete dust choking the air. Marcus dove, knife slashing Baxter's thigh, blood spurting as the cop howled, stumbling back. Voss lunged, pistol cracking, the shot grazing Marcus's arm, hot pain flaring as he tackled him, wrenching the gun free, slamming it into Voss's jaw. The militia swarmed, boots pounding, but Eli and Tia fired back, bullets pinging off rusted pipes, bodies dropping in the haze. Marcus pinned Voss, knee on his chest, forcing the pistol under his chin. "Confess," he growled, voice a blade, Lena's drone hovering, recording live. Baxter staggered up, clutching his leg, but Marcus's glare froze him. "Now!" Voss choked, spit flecking his lips, words spilling raw. "Hargrove ordered the kid shot. The church, the prison, all of it. We just pulled the triggers." Marcus shoved Voss aside, grabbing Baxter by the collar, dragging him to the drone's lens. "Say it," Baxter wheezed, blood soaking his pants, defiance cracking under the barrel's press. "He paid us, said clean up the black problem. Darius was first." The confession streamed global, views spiking, the nation's roar shaking the airwaves. "Arrest Hargrove, stop the strike!" Marcus stood chest-heaving, broadcasting their filth mid-air drop as jets circled tighter, their engines a death knell. He'd forced their truth, stopped the chaos below, thought he'd halted the purge with a blade and a lens. The radio crackled, a general's voice cutting through, sharp and final. "Airstrike aborted. Hargrove apprehended fleeing Charleston." Marcus exhaled, relief washing through the pain. Jayden's small hand gripping his leg, Lena's bruised face alight with grim victory. He'd rallied the city, beaten confessions from Baxter and Voss, sent them live, and the world had answered, jets peeling off, Hargrove's empire collapsing. For a moment, he stood tall, a soldier who'd turned a rooftop into a battlefield, a city's savior against a racist storm. He'd won, cracked the system wide, thought the war was his at last. But Hargrove didn't surrender clean. He twisted the knife. The radio buzzed again, the anchor's voice trembling. "Update, the airstrike was a decoy. Hargrove's men have infiltrated the survivors below, taking Marcus Kane hostage." Marcus spun too late as shadows rose from the rooftop's edges. Militia goons in black masks, rifles snapping up. Eli fired, dropping one, but a buttstock cracked his skull, sending him sprawling. Tia lunged, rifle blazing, but a shot tore through her chest, blood spraying as she crumpled, lifeless. Lena screamed, pistol rising, but a boot kicked it free, pinning her down. Marcus roared, knife slashing, cutting a throat, but they swarmed, fists and steel raining, his wound ripping open, blood soaking the concrete. Jayden wailed, dragged back, and Marcus fought harder, snapping a wrist, breaking a jaw, until a rifle barrel slammed his temple, stars exploding, his legs buckling. They bound him, wrists and ankles, dragging him to the roof's edge, the city. Burning below, protesters scattering as militia fired into the crowd. Hargrove's voice crackled through a goon's radio, smug and cold. "You thought you'd win, Kane. I've got you now." Marcus's vision swam, blood dripping into his eyes, the rooftop a slaughterhouse, Eli groaning, Tia dead, Lena pinned, Jayden gone. He'd rallied the survivors, forced the confession, stopped the jets, thought he'd broken Hargrove's grip, only for the sheriff's men to infiltrate, a twist he hadn't seen, turning victory into a trap. Racism wasn't just in the militia. It was in the betrayal. The way they'd waited, struck when he stood tallest, a black man's fight crushed under a lie's weight. The nation watched, the feed still live, but now it showed his defeat, a soldier bound, a city bleeding. They hauled him to a chopper landing on the roof, blades slicing the smoke, its roar drowning the sirens below. Marcus twisted, catching Lena's gaze, her bruised face defiant despite the boot on her back. "Don't stop," she mouthed, and he nodded, a silent vow as they yanked him aboard, the city shrinking beneath him. He'd broadcast the truth, halted the purge, thought he'd won Charleston's soul, but Hargrove's goons had flipped it, a decoy strike masking their move, taking him hostage in a war he'd nearly claimed. The chopper rose, the rooftop fading, and Marcus braced, bloodied but unbroken, his mind racing for the next fight. The air was cold, the chopper's hum a death knell, Charleston a fiery scar below, protesters fleeing as militia tore through. Marcus had stood on that roof, rallied a city, forced Baxter and Voss to confess, stopped the jets, only for Hargrove's men to strike from within, a betrayal that dwarfed the bridge blast. Nia was ash, Tia dead, Lena pinned, Jayden snatched. Again, and Marcus was bound, a soldier against a system that had killed 1 million to bury him. Racism ran through every cuff, every bullet, every lie that turned his stand into a fall. He'd won a battle, thought he'd shifted the war, but Hargrove's next move loomed, a shadow he couldn't yet see. The chopper banked, heading north, the city's chaos fading, the radio silent but heavy with Hargrove's threat. Marcus tested the ropes, wrists raw, his resolve hardening through the pain. He'd rallied survivors, broadcast a victory, stopped a purge only to be taken, a hostage in a war spiraling beyond the rooftop. The team was broken, the city trapped, but he wasn't done. Hargrove thought this was his end, a soldier bound and beaten. But Marcus had fought through worse, and this was just a pause, a breath before the final strike. He'd won a round, lost it in blood, and now he braced for the chaos ahead. The chopper's blade sliced through a moonless night, its roar a relentless pulse over South Carolina's shadowed coast, the air cold and biting against Marcus Kane's bloodied face. He sat bound in the cargo hold, wrists and ankles roped tight, the militia goons flanking him with rifles, their masked faces blank but their grips tense. Hargrove's voice had crackled through the radio, a smug taunt promising his end, and Marcus's shoulder wound throbbed, blood seeping through the torn fabric, a constant reminder of the rooftop betrayal. Charleston burned below, a city he'd rallied, saved from jets, only to be snatched by infiltrators, his team broken, Jayden gone again. But Marcus wasn't done. He'd fought through worse, and this bird was his battlefield. The hidden explosive was a relic from his Delta days, a palm-sized charge sewn into his jacket's lining, a last resort he'd kept since the wars. He shifted, ropes cutting his skin, fingers brushing the seam until he felt the hard lump, its trigger a thin wire he'd rigged years ago. The goons didn't notice, their eyes on the cockpit, the pilot barking cords to a hidden bunker. Marcus worked slow, deliberate, pain sharpening his focus as he freed the wire, his breath steady despite the storm in his chest. Hargrove thought he'd won, taking him hostage, but Marcus had one play left, a soldier's gambit to end this war. The chopper descended, landing hard on a concrete pad carved into a coastal bluff, the bunker's steel doors glinting under floodlights. They dragged Marcus out, boots crunching gravel, rifles jabbing his ribs as they shoved him inside, the air turning stale with earth and metal. Hargrove waited in a command room, his broad frame dwarfing a bank of screens, his sheriff's star, gone but his smirk intact, a pistol dangling in his hand. "You're a stubborn bastard, Kane," he said, voice gravelly, stepping closer, the screens flickering with Charleston's chaos. "Thought you'd bury me with your little broadcast? I've been framing men like you for decades." Marcus stood tall, ropes biting deeper, blood dripping onto the floor, his eyes locked on Hargrove's, unyielding. "You killed my son," he said, voice low, final, every word a blade. "My sister. 50 in a church, dozens more in that prison. You're done." Hargrove laughed, a harsh bark circling him like a vulture. "Done? I'm untouchable. The feds have me sure, but they'll cut a deal. You're the terrorist here, Kane. That bunker footage, already edited. You're confessing. To it all, live right now." He gestured to a camera, its red light blinking, a lie ready to seal Marcus's fate. Marcus's fingers twitched, the wire taut in his palm, his mind racing through the room. 2 guards at the door, screens showing Jayden in a cell, Lena bruised, but alive, Eli unconscious nearby. Hargrove leaned in, breath hot with whiskey, pistol tapping Marcus's chest. "Say it, Kane. Tell the world you're the monster, or I shoot your nephew next." Marcus's jaw clenched, Naya's face flashing. Darius's last gasp, the church's ash, and he moved, wire snapping free. The explosive's click lost to Hargrove's gloat. "You've got nothing," the sheriff sneered, raising the gun, but Marcus lunged, slamming into him, the charge igniting against Hargrove's chest. The blast roared, a fireball tearing through the bunker, concrete cracking, screens shattering, the guards diving as flames licked the walls. Marcus rolled, ropes burning off, his skin seared but alive. Hargrove's body hurled back, a charred husk against the rubble. The guards scrambled, rifles up, but Marcus was faster, snatching Hargrove's fallen pistol, firing twice, their heads snapping back, blood pooling under the debris. He staggered up, coughing through smoke, the bunker collapsing around him, steel groaning as he bolted for the cells, adrenaline drowning the pain. Jayden's cell was a steel box. The boy curled. In a corner, eyes wide as Marcus kicked the door open, scooping him up. "Uncle Marcus!" he cried, clinging tight, and Marcus ran, finding Lena next, her ropes cut, her pistol back in hand. Eli stirred, bloodied but breathing, hauling himself up as the ceiling buckled, dust raining. "Out!" Marcus barked, leading them through. A crumbling hall, flames chasing their heels, the bunker's guts spilling into the night. They burst onto the bluff, the chopper a wreck, the air thick with ash and salt, Charleston's glow faint on the horizon. Marcus sank to his knees, Jayden trembling against him, Lena and Eli flanking, their breaths ragged but alive. He'd triggered the blast, killed Hargrove, escaped the bunker's jaws, thought he'd ended the war with a soldier's final stand. The sheriff was ash, his lies silenced, the camera feed dead in the rubble. For a moment, he let the weight lift, Darius's death avenged, Nia's loss a scar he'd carry, Jayden safe in his arms. He'd won, turned Hargrove's execution into his own triumph, a black man's fight against a system that had tried to bury him, but the war didn't end clean. Months later, a new video surfaced, grainy but unmistakable, uploaded from an unknown source. Marcus's face filled the screen, older, leaner, his eyes harder, standing in a shadowed room, a Delta Force patch on his sleeve. "Hargrove's gone," he said, voice steady, cutting through static. "But the system that bred him isn't. I'm alive and I'm not alone." The camera panned, revealing Eli, Lena, a dozen others, faces scarred, weapons slung, an underground resistance staring. "Back. We're coming for the rest, every racist root, every badge that shields them. This isn't over." The world froze, the video spreading like wildfire, views hitting millions, protests reigniting with a vengeance. Marcus, presumed dead in the bunker's collapse, had risen, rebuilt his unit, turned his death into a rallying cry. Hargrove's men had taken him hostage, thought they'd won, but he'd flipped it, sacrificed himself to kill the sheriff, only to emerge stronger, a soldier leading a war against a system that wouldn't die with one man. Racism wasn't just in Hargrove's ash. It was in the silence that followed, the deals the feds might have cut, the roots he'd vowed to rip out. Back in the bluff's aftermath, Marcus had staged it, a decoy body left in the rubble, his escape a whisper through the chaos. He'd known Hargrove's death wouldn't end it, that the system would spin new lies, shield new monsters. Jayden was safe, hidden with allies, Lena's proof still echoing, Eli's loyalty unbroken. The video's final frame lingered. Marcus's fist raised, a promise carved in steel. "We fight until it's done." The screen cut black, the nation stunned. A revolution brewing in the shadows, he'd claimed. Charleston's scars smoldered in memory. The rooftop, the bunker, battles he'd won and lost. But Marcus stood beyond them now, a ghost turned general. He'd rallied a city, forced confessions, stopped to purge, only to be taken, thought dead, then reborn. Hargrove's end was a victory, a tyrant's ash under his boots, but the war stretched wider, deeper, a system that had hunted him since Darius's blood hit the pier. Racism ran through every badge, every broadcast, every lie he'd shattered, and now he'd turned it into a call, a soldier's vow to dismantle it all. The bluff was quiet now, the bunker's ruins a tomb, the chopper's wreckage a monument. To his stand, Marcus had walked away, Jayden in his arms, Lena and Eli at his side, knowing the fight wasn't over, that Hargrove's death was a spark, not a fire's end. The video months later proved it, his face a beacon, his unit a blade, the world watching a man who'd sacrificed everything to rise again. He'd won the battle, killed the sheriff, escaped the noose. But the twist was his life, a soldier presumed dead, now leading a war that'd shake the nation's core. The coastal wind carried ash away, the night stretching endless, a new dawn brewing in Marcus's shadow. He'd fought for Darius, for Nia, for 50 in a church, for dozens in a prison, for a city trapped by Hargrove's lies, and now he fought for more, a soldier against a system that'd never stop unless he made it. The video's echo lingered, his fist raised, his voice a promise, and Marcus Kane, once a grieving father, now a revolutionary, braced for the chaos he'd unleash, a war that'd end when justice wasn't just a word, but a truth carved in blood and fire. This story of Marcus Kane unveils profound lessons about resilience, justice, and the enduring fight against systemic racism. First, it teaches that courage isn't just physical. It's the will to stand tall when the world tries to bury you. Marcus, a retired Delta Force commander, faced unimaginable loss. His son Darius gunned down, his sister Nia killed, his home torched, yet he transformed grief into a relentless quest for truth. His journey shows that even in the darkest moments, one person's resolve can ignite a movement. Second, it exposes the insidious depth of racism, not just in violent acts but in the systems that shield them. Hargrove's empire thrived on lies, framing Marcus as a terrorist, proving that power often bends justice to protect its own. Third, it underscores the strength of community. Protesters, allies like Lena, and Marcus's team rallied against oppression, amplifying a single voice into a national roar. Finally, the twist of Marcus's death and resurgence as a revolutionary leader reveals that true victory isn't in one battle, but in the unwavering fight for change. His story isn't just a tale of vengeance. It's a call to confront injustice head-on, to question the narratives fed to us, and to build a future where no one's blood stains the pier for being who they are. What lessons resonate with you? How far would you go to fight a system stacked against you? Drop 1 in the comments if Marcus's courage inspires you, 2 if you think the system's too broken to fix, and hit like if this story stirred your soul. Subscribe and share to keep this fight alive. Justice needs every voice. Thanks for joining Marcus's war. May you find strength to stand for what's right in your own battles.